This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 88 of Here's How for the 12th of July 2019. Renewable energy is much in the news, but we don't seem to be considering one major source of energy that's not from fossil fuels. In this podcast, I'll talk to someone advocating nuclear energy for Ireland.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
In a few minutes we'll have this. Using today's technology and using nuclear to replace fossil fuels, then it would run out very, very quickly.
No, it wouldn't, because they're talking about known reserves. And
No, they're not. No. I'm adding known reserves and additional reserves that are assumed to be there but are undiscovered. And even at today's rate of consumption, it lasts for 230 years. So that's 230 years. It's quite a long time, but it's not a very long time. But that's only you supplying 4% of the world's energy. That's coming up in a couple of minutes. First of all, I want to say thanks to all of my Patreon donors. I really appreciate them all. Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, which helps me to devote more time to finding interesting guests and doing research. If you think you could do the same as they do, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. If, when I say tick-tock, your mind goes to a clock and not to the music that you can hear in the background, then you're not in the demographic for tick-tock.
I would move in with his missus. What? Get a life. You're living with his wife. Like, what was I meant to do?
TikTok is a video sharing app with a very young user base. It's got something approaching 1 billion users, and that's not even counting the users of a parallel app in China called Douyin, which is basically identical except firewalled off to comply with Chinese censorship laws. To put that 1 billion users in context, Facebook took almost 8 years to get to 1 billion users. TikTok won't be 3 years old until September. The videos are limited normally to 15 seconds in duration, and, as you might expect, they normally center on youth, music and culture. If you want to feel old, download it and swipe through a few of the videos. Users who get more than 1,000 followers unlock a feature that allows them to do live streams to all of those followers and broadcast live video to them. So far, so standard social media. But the other aspect of TikTok is the ability to send virtual gifts. Basically, users can send digital gifts to each other. In case you don't know what that is, it just means that a cute little symbol pops up on the user's screen. Obviously, they don't have any value, except when they do. Gifts have cute names like Panda, Rainbow Puke, Sun Cream, and Drama Queen. But to send them, users must pay for them, and the prices range from a few cents for the Panda to almost €50 for the Drama Queen. Remember that there's nothing of value here apart from the fact that young users seem to be willing to pay to send them. And they're sending them to TikTok stars, those people with more than 1,000 followers, or in some cases millions of followers. ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok and its Chinese equivalent Douyin, seems to have hit on a formula that encourages young people to hand over their money in return for very insubstantial benefits, like having their favorite TikTok star call out their name on a live stream. And it can be very young people, pre-teens, and it can be a lot of money. Some kids have sent hundreds of euro worth of gifts. There's nothing in the software to check their age or limit how much they spend. It seems that half of this money goes to the recipient and half to ByteDance, propelling it to a valuation of $75 billion. I'm not saying all of this to go off on a moral panic or to do a Maud Flanders saying somebody think of the children. There certainly are exploitative aspects to this, but the point that I'm interested in is, firstly, that these social networks can mushroom from nothing to apparent global dominance within a couple of years, and they can melt away just as fast. Remember Vine? It was the previous video sharing phenomena. It was bought by Twitter for only $30 million 6 months after it launched. It lasted 4 years in total. And remember Keek and Mixbit? No, me neither. But they were both at one stage the next big video sharing platforms, and they're gone now too. I think it shows that many areas of the internet are still a wild west. We have some way to go before it takes on the characteristics of a mature business platform. If I were TikTok, I'd take those billions and run. The same probably goes for Facebook and Twitter.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Dennis Duff. He's the author of a website called BENE, Better Environment with Nuclear Energy. He's well qualified for that as well. He's a mechanical engineer. He has 30 years experience with the ESB in power generation. Now he works as an independent engineering consultant in Ireland and abroad. Dennis, why nuclear energy for Ireland?
It's a good question, William. We all know that introducing nuclear into Ireland would not be easy. There's a lot of perceptions about it being unpopular and dangerous and the waste problem and all that. So it's a good question to ask me, why would I bother trying to open people's eyes to nuclear in Ireland when it's going to be an uphill battle. And really, I suppose the Climate Plan 2019 was published by the government yesterday. It's an all-of-government plan to try and reach net zero emissions by 2050. And it shows the difficulties that's involved in trying to do that. When we look at the electricity system in particular, we see that they're aiming for 70% renewables by 2030. But that will only reduce emissions to a level of about 4 to 5 million tonnes in their view. And it becomes increasingly difficult to reduce the emissions from there on. And we really need to get to zero. So to cut a long story short, we believe that with focusing almost entirely on renewables will not reduce our emissions to the levels that are required. And the only way to do that is by introducing nuclear energy. And that's why we're at it.
Oh, okay. There's a couple of things with that. First of all, I think, and you mentioned a perception problem, selling it to the public problem. I seem to remember, at least in Dublin City Council, them putting up signs around the city saying this is a nuclear-free city, which is a fairly easy thing to do. But it was obviously to gain popularity because nuclear energy is something that's not popular. Is that justified in your view?
Well, you'll also notice that they've taken down those signs. They took them down in Cork as well because they realised that we're actually using nuclear energy, first of all, through the interconnector that comes from Britain, but more indirectly, we're using nuclear in our hospitals, in our industry. I mean, I used nuclear sources to test wells, the quality of wells in metal. In my own industry, we use them in hospitals. We go for radiotherapy when we have cancer, and some nuclear seem to be good, and other nuclear has a bad reputation. But at the same time, we find that there are hundreds of millions of people living in countries, sensible countries like France, Switzerland, Spain, Britain, America. I could go on, that are living beside nuclear power plants quite happily. And in fact, we often holiday beside them without, Irish people holiday beside them without it costing us a second thought. So I think our fears of nuclear are somewhat exaggerated. And if we examine them really, we would find actually we're probably not as afraid of it as we thought we were.
I've been watching the Netflix series Chernobyl. That makes me pretty afraid.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen it, but I've read quite a bit about it. Look, no one is talking about putting in a Chernobyl type of plant in Ireland. In fact, nobody ever put in a Chernobyl type of plant anywhere in the West. It was a uniquely Soviet design. The Soviet engineers knew of the frailties in the design. Western engineers were telling them as well that, listen, this is not a safe design, don't put it in.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not talking about putting in a Chernobyl. That's like saying, oh, look, Concorde had a major crash there many years ago, so we're not going to ever fly in and out of Ireland again. I mean, it's ridiculous. We're talking about putting in, or at least considering, appropriately sized, safe, modern nuclear plants for Ireland. And the reason why we would hope to do that is because we would reduce our emissions from electricity to zero within a few years, and it's actually much cheaper than the alternative path.
Okay, I want to examine a couple of those. So first of all, I was looking at one other website called Next Big Future, which I think promotes the same sort of thing that you're saying, and they put up a table, and it's quite an eye-opening table, and the table is death rate per terawatt hour of electricity generated. So it's essentially how many people are killed for a fixed unit of electricity generated. Nuclear comes at the bottom of the list. Coal is horrendous. Coal is at the top of the list because a lot of coal miners die, particularly in China, in coal mining, to the point that by that table, nuclear energy is about 4,000 times safer than coal-generated electricity, and it's hundreds of times safer than, for example, rooftop solar, because sometimes people fall off the roof when they're installing solar panels.
Yes, that is a surprise. Yes, yeah. To find that nuclear comes bottom of the death rate table, which is actually the best it can be, is a surprise to a lot of people. As is a lot of facts about nuclear. When you actually look at the hard science behind the statistics, you find that nuclear is actually the safest. Now, look, no one is talking about putting in new coal plants either. So we have to compare like with like, I suppose. We're talking about possibly renewables and nuclear and some gas plant going into Ireland. If you put in nuclear, you don't need the gas plant. But you should compare the stats of nuclear against the likely future technologies, including renewables. And while nuclear has a better record, that doesn't mean that renewables are so dangerous that we shouldn't use them. But what we're saying is that all the above technologies, nuclear, renewables, and gas turbines, are safe enough for us to use. However, the gas turbines come with a CO2 impact, which has emissions, which is an indirect cause of health and danger to people. So
pause on that thought for a moment. Pause on that.
Okay.
Because I think that table is flawed. Because what it is doing is it is looking at historic data. And pretty much whenever you mine coal, some miners get killed when they mine coal, but the risk of that ends once the coal has been mined. The risk of nuclear energy does not end once that nuclear energy has been generated. And we will, in the event that we were to use nuclear energy, and for nuclear energy that, as you say correctly, is in use in France and Britain and so forth, we're relying on a presumption that a sophisticated industrial society will persist for tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years into the future to manage that waste. And that's actually hundreds of times longer than a sophisticated industrial society has already existed. So we're, expecting something that has only so far lasted a couple of hundred years to endure for hundreds of thousands of years into the future. That's a hell of a presumption, isn't it?
What you're talking about there is the nuclear waste. First of all, to talk about the coal, when you say that when it's mined, that's the end of it. But in fact, no, because coal goes on then to be burnt, and it produces carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and they're greenhouse gases, which have a lifetime in the atmosphere of up to 100 years. But notwithstanding that, to get back to the nuclear fuel and the nuclear waste, we have over 60 years experience of dealing with nuclear waste, and in that time it has caused absolutely no problems to anybody whatsoever. Now, when you talk about risk...
No, but that's because it has caused no problems, because we have a sophisticated industrial society which can manage to deal with it. That it is by no means a given that will continue to exist. Okay,
so let's take a worst case scenario and assume that society breaks down irretrievably, and the nuclear waste is just left
Just let's say that the capacity to deal with it breaks down.
Okay, so let's say that happens. Okay, so we have spent fuel. They could be in rods, they could be in the cooling ponds, or they could be in dry cask storage, which most of them are at the moment. And what is the danger? So far, there's been no danger to the nuclear waste has caused no problem to anybody whatsoever. Now, if somebody in the future comes close to these nuclear, it's only when they become close, when they actually touch the rods or break up the rods and start eating it, that they get themselves into a dangerous situation.
Or it's involved in an earthquake and it goes into the water system.
Yeah, first of all, the nuclear fuel is stored above ground, far away from water courses. Now, we have experience, the Earth has experience of having nuclear waste in a water system, believe it or not. And this occurred in a place called Oklo in Gabon about 2 billion years ago. And it was found that because uranium is a natural product, it's been there since the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. And it has a half-life of around 4.6 billion years as it happens. So it means that there was twice as much of the radioactive uranium available 2 billion years ago. And what happened was there was natural uranium. There was a seam of it in Oklo in Gabon, and a river or a stream just happened to be passing over that seam. And it created the conditions exactly correct to create a nuclear reactor, a natural nuclear reactor, which operated on and off, I believe, for 200 million years. And since that time, the reactor has turned itself off because the uranium isn't as enriched as it used to be. And they find that the nuclear waste hasn't moved from the site of that seam of enriched uranium. So it's not something which is soluble in water and gets itself carried off into the water course and becomes instantly fatal to people who come in contact with that water. Because what happens is, even if a tiny amount, I'm talking micrograms of the uranium was to go into the water course, it's a heavy metal, it will fall to the bottom and into the silt. And if any other products, which are tiny amounts, were to get in contact with the water course, the dilution of that would render the radioactivity negligible, almost indetectable. Because after all, we are living in a nuclear environment. The whole Earth is radioactive. The air that comes in from is impacted by solar rays, which has radioactivity attached to it. We have radioactivity in cigarettes. We get radioactivity from the ground, from radon gas, from medical procedures.
But it's not as concentrated as one would expect it in a nuclear power station, for example, in Chernobyl or Fukushima.
Yes, so that's why we don't go right next to the reactor core that's broken down in Fukushima, for instance. Once you're outside the reactor building, you are not in any danger from the radioactivity from it, because the radioactivity decreases with distance. So the only danger, you could go to Fukushima with your Geiger counter and you could pick up slightly elevated readings from the environment. But if you had your Geiger counter on the airplane that brought you to Japan, you would find that those readings went even higher.
Because you're above the atmosphere and you're getting radiation from space. Okay, I want to move on from the safety argument, and I want to look at some of the practicalities of this. And I looked up the sources of energy around the world, and it breaks down roughly that oil and gas each are a third of all the energy we use. Natural gas is about a quarter, and the rest is broken down. 4% is nuclear and about 10% is renewable. Now, one thing I also saw was that in the Scientific American, they've calculated how much uranium that there is available to us on Earth. And we've all heard about peak oil. So this is another reason perhaps to move away from fossil fuels. Even if they weren't damaging the atmosphere, they're going to run out and we're going to need to replace them with some other source of energy. And Scientific American said that there's about 5.5 million metric tons of known deposits of uranium, and about twice that they would statistically expect to be able to discover if they were prospecting for it, knowing how much there is and how much they've looked. And that's about a 230-year supply at today's consumption rate. But that's 230 years of 4% of the Earth's energy. If, and of course it's unlikely to happen, but if nuclear was to immediately take over from fossil fuels, then we'd be consuming it at a far faster rate, and it would run out in 10 years. We don't have as much energy in nuclear as we have in fossil fuels. How are we going to cope with that?
Well, I think we actually do have more energy from nuclear than we have from fossil fuels, because the technology that we're using so far in nuclear extracts around about 1.5% of the available energy from the uranium. And then that spent fuel, as it's called, is stored. Now, there are two options for the spent fuel. One, we can put it into safe repositories and leave it underground. Or the other is that we can use a new breed of nuclear reactors, which is in design. Some of them have been produced already, but they're being the design is being modernized, where we can get the remaining 95% or thereabouts of the energy from the uranium, 60 times more energy from what's called spent fuel than we got already. And that's just from uranium. We also can use thorium, which is far more plentiful in the Earth's crust than uranium is, and it can produce far more energy. So while no one is saying
would you accept, Dennis, would you accept that using today's technology and using nuclear to replace fossil fuels, then it would run out very, very quickly?
No, it wouldn't, because they're talking about known reserves. And,
No, they're not. No. I'm adding known reserves and additional reserves that are assumed to be there but are undiscovered. And even at today's rate of consumption, it lasts for 230 years. So that's 230 years. That's quite a long time, but it's not a very long time. But that's only you supplying 4% of the world's energy.
Okay, well, not been familiar with that particular study. Can I ask you, William, have they considered the amount of uranium that's already in the oceans? Have they considered extracting that?
Well, no, that's not in that, and that's okay. Is there a viable method of extracting that?
Yes, there is. Yes.
Okay.
It's been under research in Japan for the last number of years, and they have some success with that. So, as I said, not been familiar with that particular study. You can rest assured that the people who are investing globally hundreds of billions of euros in energy systems, including nuclear, have done their sums on it, and they know that there is definitely sufficient uranium available for the next 80 years for their plant that they're planning at the moment. We have an environmental and emissions crisis at the moment, and it's called an emergency.
Yep.
And we need to take action. We need to take serious action that's going to reduce our emissions, and if we can do it at least cost and in the safest possible method, well, that's better for all of us. And there is sufficient uranium for us to do that. From what I know of it, I know that the more that you spend looking for a product, the more of it you tend to find. If you take, for instance, what the current known availability of copper is, you'd say, oh my God, it's kind of 30 years. So we better stop using copper.
Yeah, but so the price goes up. That incentivizes people to look harder, and then they find more. That's right. Yeah, that's well known. But the figure that I quoted is including that, and is including not just known reserves, but also statistically calculated guesses at unknown reserves. But just to move on from that, for what you're proposing, would Ireland get one nuclear power plant, several? What's the scale of that?
Yes, well, Ireland is a small grid internationally. We have probably about 25 large power stations at the moment, and that's good. It gives diversity. It means that if one unit goes down, it's only a small proportion of the entirety. So
the others can kick up a gear.
So the best way to do this is to have a number of small reactors. And the ideal thing would be that no single reactor would be more than 10% of our lowest demand, which would put it around 200 megawatts. Mm-hmm. So there are nuclear reactors. Like to go back a little bit further, we actually have the largest plant on the Irish system at the moment is 450 megawatts. Mm-hmm. So we can handle that quite easily.
So as I understand it, you're the engineer on this, but as I understand it, you need always to have in the system enough spare capacity to take your biggest generator offline in case that's necessary.
That's absolutely right. Yes, because if you lost any generator on the system, the other generators have to make it up. In the meantime, the frequency would fall, and there are very strict controls over the frequency range. You know, the way we have 50 cycles a second in Ireland, 50 hertz. You know, you've heard that. The acceptable range is something like 49.9 to 50.1, so it's a very tight range. Mm-hmm. So you cannot afford to lose over 10% of your input at any time without putting a serious impact on the electricity system and risk of brownout or blackout in certain areas. So what we would ideally look for are a number of units of, say, 400 megawatts or smaller. Mm-hmm. So if we were to target zero emissions from our electricity system by 2050, we would look and just say, for instance, if we took that we wanted to get 50% from renewables and 50% from another base load source such as nuclear, mm-hmm. well, then you could put in, say, 2,500 to 3,000 megawatts worth of nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And if the units came in, say, 200 megawatt size, well, then you're looking at 10 to 12 units. Mm-hmm. There's a particular unit called the NuScale, which is a 360 megawatt unit. So you'd put in 7 or 8 of them. You can, if you have those NuScale units, by the way, of 360 megawatts, they're actually made up of modules of 60 megawatts each. So each mm-hmm. one is very, very small and it'd be an ideal size for the Irish grid. So that's what you're talking about. As regards cost of that, our conservative estimates would show that the cost of a system, including nuclear like that, would actually be lower than the costs projected for the Climate Plan 2019, which is published just yesterday.
Okay, I want to actually move on to that costings, because I was talking last week to Fergal Mulligan of the Department of Communications about the National Broadband Plan, and we all know of the gigantic pricing on that, and also on the National Children's Hospitals. And Fergal Mulligan made the point that the government and national procurement services have gotten over the problem of huge cost overruns. And I don't think he was correct, and I kind of missed a beat not asking him the question, because he made the point that we used to have enormous overruns on the cost of road building projects. Those have now largely been contained. It's at least not as bad as it was. But I think the reason that happened is because our institutional memory, our state apparatus for commissioning roads made every single mistake that was possible to make and finally learned from them. And the reason why the National Broadband Plan and the National Children's Hospital are going into so many billions is because the state has no experience in commissioning these type of things. Isn't it likely that, well, it's not likely, it almost always happens that major infrastructure projects go vastly over budget?
Well, if you take the nuclear plant, absolutely. That has been the experience. There's no doubt about it. But if you take power generation, Ireland has an excellent record of installing power stations here, reasonably on time and reasonably on budget ever since the ESB was formed in 1927. So it's almost 100 years of experience at it. The power stations that I have worked in Ireland were all built, as I say, reasonably on time and reasonably on budget. Some of them under budget. So it's quite like if ESB got the award to build the nuclear power plants, they would get involved with an international consortium who have experience at building these nuclear power plants. They could get involved in a fixed price contract. There are various different ways of ensuring that the contract is delivered.
Sure, yeah, of course, there are various different ways. People all around the world manage it, but Ireland is exceptionally poor at managing it, and Ireland in particular is exceptionally poor at managing novel projects. And, you know, if people see that Ireland can't even build a port tunnel without leaks, they're not going to have faith that we can build a nuclear power station without leaks.
Okay, well, not to go into the port tunnel, but the port tunnel was designed to have leaks because every tunnel that goes underwater has leaks, and it's designed to manage the leaks. So I'm not 100% familiar with the port tunnel. But Ireland has what we're talking about on the energy side, we're talking about building world-class, world-leading, the world has never seen anything like the amount of renewables that we're planning to put into Ireland. So what we're saying is that we wouldn't be capable of building a nuclear system that other countries have done, but we are more than capable of building a world-class and world-leading renewable system on time and to budget. That doesn't make sense. When you look at other industries, look at Intel have a multi-billion euro facilities and are developing more. They have confidence that they're able to build projects on time and to budget in Ireland. There are other examples. So I think that if we don't have the ability, and I don't buy this anti-Irish thing that Ireland always does everything wrong.
No, I'm not saying that. But Ireland and every country has particular. Ireland and every other country has particular strengths and particular weaknesses, and Ireland has an exceptionally poor record of managing novel type major projects. That's true, isn't it?
Well, if that's the case, do you think that we're going to be able to introduce our world-leading heavily renewables electricity system?
Well, that's first of all, that's largely privatized, but it's also distributed, and it's a large number of very small projects. Nuclear will be a much smaller number of much larger projects. But I take your point that nuclear is only one of the major projects we need to do, and we need to do some of them. But if it's done poorly, the consequences are more catastrophic.
Well, they're not, because the nuclear plants are designed to modern nuclear plants to stringent safety standards. Now, don't forget that the plan that we intend to go through, which is heavily renewable, isn't only renewables. It has a lot of gas plant, but also hidden in the Climate Plan 2019 is the intention to look at carbon capture and storage plants, which involves a fossil fuel plant where you take the carbon dioxide emissions from the stack and you pipe it underground and put it in some storage area somewhere where it stays under pressure forever and a day. Mm-hmm. So are we saying then that we won't be able to introduce that as well? Do you know what I mean? We have to have confidence in our ability to deliver international projects to an international standard. And in power generation, we have shown a repetitive ability to do that. I see no reason why that should stop for carbon capture, for the major renewables plan, or indeed for the nuclear plan.
Dennis, I want to say thank you to David McDonough, one of the listeners who suggested that I talk to you, and also thanks to you, Dennis Duff, author of the website called BENE.ie, Better Environment with Nuclear Energy. Thanks very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Record a contribution to be included in the next show. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
If you'd like to hear more podcasts from me, I'd certainly love to do them, and I could devote more time to them if I got them sponsored. I have a page on Patreon that allows ordinary listeners to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, whatever you want. So if you think that it's valuable, please do that and share the podcast to your friends so they can do the same. Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and follow Dennis at Nuclear Ireland, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that, including my Patreon link, are at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.
Think about it, maybe. XO, baby. Here we go. You sent him kisses. I didn't know I would move in with his missus. What? Get a life. You're living with his wife. Like, what was I meant to do?